Assalamualaikum and a good day to you, sir. I'm Wasamiti Amran, and here I'll be presenting on my part in the Act, which is the LGBT Act 2022. This is an act that is to provide fair and equal treatment towards the LGBT individuals, ensuring their rights and protect them from any kind of discrimination. For the first part in preliminary, I would like to highlight the exception where it states that the act is not applicable towards the Muslim. Within the Quran, although homosexuality is not punishable by death, modern historians conclude that the Prophet was condemned towards their existence. Some hadith even condemn such act of homosexual and transgender, prescribing the death penalty towards both of them. Same-sex acts are prohibited in traditional Islamic jurisprudence, whereas for Western jurisprudence, it is of the perspective on the right of freedom of conscience. LGBT persons have the same human rights as others because of their human dignity, which is evidenced by their endowed reason and conscience, and not by the virtue of their sexual attraction or gender preferences.
Of this act represents the positivism jurisprudence, in which the law is the command of the sovereign, which imposes a duty on its resident and is enforceable by sanctions as defined by Austin. I choose this session because everyone should respect each other no matter their race, gender, or religion. Under Islamic jurisprudence, there are two views regarding homosexuality, which the first view considered homosexuality as nasty behavior, whereas the second view provides that homosexuality is an unchosen orientation of a minority of people. Despite that LGBT is not permitted under the Islamic religion, they should not discriminate LGBT. However, when Section 4 of this Act becomes law, discrimination and defamation towards the Act, LGBT and LGBT friends and family is an offence. By referring to the positivism jurisprudence or legal positivism, this section is a command of the sovereign to the people who choose whose sanctions will be imposed if they disobey this provision. Section 5 of this Act represents the sociological jurisprudence, in which an individual's projections of self in a society is connected with his honor in the community. The reason that I include this provision is that even though we have the freedom of speech, but it must have certain limits in which the speech did not cause harm to a person's reputation, especially to the group of LGBT in the eyes of other persons. Under Islamic jurisprudence, the Holy Quran refers defamation as an inhuman action, which it is described as eating flesh of a dead brother. Besides that, under Western jurisprudence, defamation is not allowed as it will affect the interests of a person. Section 6 of this Act represents the Dorking jurisprudence on race. Dorking has established the Equal Protection Clause, which embodies that no one in the society should suffer because he is a group member thought less worthy of respect as a group than other groups. The reason that I choose this session is because a person's capabilities in the workplace should not be affected by his or her gender or identity. Undeniably, LGBT is the seen from the religious perspective under Islamic jurisprudence. However, despite the religious aspect, LGBT as the worker who distribute their time, knowledge, and energy to help others in the workplace or during employment should be appreciated by the people. On the other hand, referring to Ronald Dworkin's theories of law, LGBT should be given fair and equal opportunity as others in not only in the workplace and during employment.
Good day to Sir Shafiq. I am Ling Yifeng. My metric number is 056036. The provisions that I'm going to present are Part 4 and Part 5 of the LGBT Act. With regard to Part 4, the first applicable Western jurisprudence is natural law theory that recognizes both law and morality are mutually intertwined. Therefore, actions that would prohibit an LGBT from living a good and happy life, such as sexual harassment against them, are considered as immoral. Pattern unionists under the social contract means an agreement reached between humans to respect each other's lives. Although some people might not be able to accept the LGBT behavior, they are still required to respect their lives, but not to sexually harass them, as per sections 7, 8, and 9 of the LGBT Act. Moreover, one of the key features of the legal positivism is the principle of verifiability, which means that only the empirical verifiable statements are considered as cognitively significant. In fact, there are data and surveys proving that a lot of LGBT people suffer from sexual harassment. A research from the Trades Union Congress discovered that around 70% of the LGBT people have been sexually harassed at their workplace. For instance, 2 in 5 LGBT people have experienced unwanted remarks or questions regarding their sexuality from their colleagues. Section 8 Clause 1 was therefore drafted to prohibit such disrespectful comments or questions, while Section 10 was enacted to make sure that LGBT victims also have access to relief in the event sexual harassment occurs at their workplaces. In verses 80 and 81 of Surah Al-Araf, it states that, "And remember when Lot scolded his people, saying that, did you commit such immorality as no one has preceded you from among the worlds? Indeed, you approach men with desire instead of women. Rather, you are a transgressing people." This verse clearly indicates that in Islam, homosexuality is a despicable act that shall be condemned. That's why Section 7 Clause 4 is not applicable to Muslims despite there is a mutual consent to engage in sodomy or sexual intercourse with the LGBT people. There is one hadith from Abu Musa al-Ash'ari whereby the Prophet states that when a woman comes upon a woman, they are both adulteresses. When a man comes upon a man, they are both adulterers. The meaning of this hadith is that any sexual relation between lesbians or gay are totally intolerable and are considered as adultery. Therefore, Section 7 Clause 5 clearly states that Muslims who commit any unlawful sexual conduct with the LGBT people shall be punished according to Islamic rulings. Applying Jeremy Bentham's principle of utility, children deserve to have a joyful, happy, and pain-free childhood, but not to be subjected to abhorrent sexual offenses. Thus, sexual offenses against children are strictly forbidden under Section 12. If such offenses can be mitigated, it definitely can increase the overall happiness of the children because their safety is more guaranteed. According to Austin, there are 3 main components to constitute law, namely command, duty, and sanction. By virtue of Section 15, it commands that LGBT parents or guardians have a duty to protect their children or worse from any kind of sexual offense. If they fail to fulfill this duty, they will be sanctioned with the punishment prescribed under Part 10. Pursuant to Sharia law, sexual abuse of a child may constitute zina, which is punishable by death, life imprisonment, or whipping, subject to circumstances of each case. In a hadith reported by Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, the Prophet has said that whosoever of you sees an evil, let him change it with his hand. If he is unable to do so, then with his tongue. If he is unable to do so, then with his heart, and that's the weakest of faith. Section 15 is enacted to ensure parents or guardians will take prompt actions once they discover that their children or worse are the victims of sexual offenses.
I will now continue with Part 6, which is prohibitions of physical attack, assault, torture, psychological violence. All these actions constitute violence, physical and mental form, which are expressly prohibited under Islamic and Western jurisprudence. So, firstly, Islam is a religion of peace, and obviously, all actions demonstrated here is not a peaceful action as it inflicts harms to individuals of LGBT. Next, the universal principles of human welfare in Islamic teaching shall be referred, which is protections of life and dignity, which is prohibitions for all the safe actions. While for the Western jurisprudence, positivist jurist H.L. Earhart provides that human conditions which are called simple truisms, which is human vulnerability to physical attacks and approximate equality of human in mental and physical ability. Therefore, law must at least contain natural necessity, which are restrictions on the free exercise of violence and based on mutual forbearance. While following legal positivism or analytical school views, the principles of utilitarians are similar to sociological school, which one act shall be regarded as criminal if it makes society unhappy. So punishment must take place to ensure justice. According to Just Austin, one thing can only be regarded as law if it comprises of three elements, namely command, duty, and sanctions. Therefore, the command here is that the gazette of this act. Duty is the need of all citizens to obey this act, and there will be punishments if failure to do so, which these provisions had expressly mentioned. Even the intention will be prohibited. Law is the command of sovereignty. In addition, following anthropological jurisprudence, Hobble has stated that existence of law is to identify socially acceptable lines of behavior for inclusion in the culture, which is to determine relationships among the members of a society. In sociological school, according to Durkheim, an act is criminal when it is perceived as offending the collective conscience. So sociological school, following the views of Rudolf von Jhering, which is also known as jurisprudence of interest, law as a means to an end, where individuals will be happy if society is happy. There must be external state correlations, which is violence-free and peace and protections of dignity. Next, we move on to part 7, which is registrations of marriage. Firstly, it is pertinent to note that this part is inapplicable for Muslims, which follow chapter 7, verse 80 and 81 of Quran. As according to Islamic jurisprudence, marriage is expected to be a union from a man and woman. Same goes to Western jurisprudence of natural law. So this homosexual practice or bisexual is a capital crime. Therefore, in view that this is Malaysian law which practices plural legal systems that inclusive of Sharia that binds all Muslims. So for transgender practice, Islamic jurisprudence expressly prohibits it. As changes or alterations of national states does not change the core identity of an original thing. This can be clearly seen in the official portal of Federal Department of Sharia Judiciary Malaysia, where it falls within the criminal case code 115 and 116. While according to Western jurisprudence, marriage is a personal choice, this actually in accordance with the Critical Legal Studies or CLS, where law is politics and majority will domain the country. LGBT being normalized in Malaysia upon large exposure to foreign culture and social media, which means the social experimentations and inquiry had been conducted that have direct legal changes and legitimates the existing social order in subtle and imperceptible ways. Similarly, social logical approach takes place where society forms the law and dynamic nature of social interest. Therefore, the normalizations and the welcoming attitude, especially young generations, was applications of CLS. So Malaysians nowadays more concerned about liberty and the fact that most Western countries in international conference and organizations such as Human Rights Watch and SOHACM had also urged the Malaysian government to ensure LGBT rights in line with international human rights standards. Therefore, upon considerations of politics and social demands and economics, CLS and sociological applies, and this leads to social transformation.
In part 8, the cross-dressing. Scholars of Islamic jurisprudence are unanimous in saying that the prohibition against men dressing up as women is grounded in the hadith traditions of the Prophet. Islam strongly condemns blasphemy, whereas the West takes it as an extension of freedom of expression and a symbol of human rights and democracy.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Saifa Azuminti Azman and my matrix number is 056356, and today I will be presenting on my part for the act that have been legislated by my group, which is the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual and Transgender Act 2022. For my part, I will be explaining part 9 with regards to the rights of LGBT as well as part 11 for the general exceptions. Firstly, for rights, Islamic jurisprudence recognizes the rights of human beings, but it depends on what types of rights. So there are numbers of issues that go beyond the normal scope of human rights because it clashes with the Islamic teachings. For instance, with regards to such as to education, healthcare, vote and speak, under section 23 and 37, all human deserve to be treated equally because this is fully acceptable under the Islamic jurisprudence. However, if the Gender Act as mentioned under section 22, which is the right to change gender in their identity card, is not truly being supported under the Islamic jurisprudence because it goes beyond the normal scope of the human rights. Also, according to the human rights under Islamic jurisprudence, it is only compatible to the extent that human rights do not challenge the Islamic law. So for section 22, it is not applicable because Allah has created men and women and they are not allowed to change their gender. So this type of person is known as Mukhanatun and Al-Mutarajilat, which refer to men or women who try to imitate the opposite gender through their clothing, manner and so on. Also, section 28, which is the right to adopt children, is also not applicable under the Islamic jurisprudence because it mentions that the child can be adopted by the same-sex parents. So Islam strongly prohibits homosexual practice, and it is stated under hadith narrated by Abdullah bin Ibn Abbas, where if a man who is not married is seized committing sodomy, he will be stoned to death. And then the next one for Western jurisprudence, the first one is legal positivism. The right is referred to the Bentham's theory of law where it suits the principle of utility. By providing the rights for LGBT in this act, it is certain that this can achieve the happiness among the society because none of them will be discriminated anymore as they will acquire equal rights with the other people. And next one for sociological school, based on Rudolf von Jhering, his philosophy is known as jurisprudence of interest. So Jhering stressed that law does not exist for the the individual as an end in himself but serves his interests with the good of the society in view. So his doctrine relates to the social utilitarianism, which is similar to Bentham's theory. To relate with the rights of LGBT, Jering's theory is applicable because when the rights for LGBT is given, the law is meant to be an end because it will end with the justice for the LGBT group. For example, based on Section 24, LGBT may have a right to apply for medical insurance, and this will bring an ease to them in the case where they have involved in any medical treatment. The law will not be considered to be an end if the LGBT is still oppressed from getting medical insurance because it will be injustice on part of the LGBT group. For natural schools, Section 22, 28 and 29 is not applicable because changing the gender in identity card, adoption by same-sex parents and equal sex is truly opposite to the nature because there are only two genders available as human beings. Also, adoption by same-sex parents is not applicable because children naturally born with parents, which include men as the father and women as the mother.
In Part 10, the penalty upon contravention, this part lists the punishment towards offenders that contravenes this act. In Islam, punishment is the retaliation of evil. The kinds of punishment in Islam includes hudud, qisas, ta'zir, al-sasadiyah. As in the Western, punishment is a penalty or sanction given for any crime or offences which includes the death penalty, deportation, exile, imprisonment, corporal punishment and also fine. Both jurisprudence plays a role of correcting a wrong that is detrimental to the society.
For Part 11, with regards to the general exceptions, Islamic jurisprudence is applicable because the highest degree of legal capacity is sound mind and age of majority. So according to School of Shafi'i, a Muslim starts to achieve their puberty at the age of 15 for both males and females. Also, under Section 51 of the Sharia Criminal Offences Act 1997, it states that nothing is an offence which is done by a child who is not baligh. And then under Western jurisprudence, for natural law, it is applicable because naturally a minor usually cannot distinguish between what is good and what is bad because their brain cell seems to be still underdeveloped compared to adults. Whereas for insanity, a person stands to have unreasonable behavior which may cause harmful conduct to the society.
Next, I will continue with the part 12 of this act, which is miscellaneous. For these three provisions, it generally deals with the authority and procedures. So in Islamic jurisprudence, it is laid down that Islam obedience to the law of the land is a religious duty, which the Quran commands Muslims to remain faithful to not only God and the Prophet, but also the authority they live under. Therefore, if Muslim breaches this law, they shall and violate to be punished. Meanwhile, for Western jurisprudence, sociological school, firstly, according to Max Weber's theory of legitimate authority, there must be a legitimate persons or institutions of authority for people to obey the law. So meanwhile, Weber's typology of law, Weber's definitions of law actually resembles the traditional positivists, that an order will be called law if it is externally guaranteed by the probability that there is correlations, either physical or psychological, to bring about conformity of avenge violations to be applied by a staff of people holding themselves especially ready for the purpose. So next, formally rational law under sociological school, that's the law and general principles are gapless which contain answers to all legal problems. So the development of formally rational law, according to Weber, shall conceptually systemize as well as the professionalisms of legal practice and educational systems. In addition, following anthropological jurisprudence, Hobel has stated that assistant of law is to allocate authority and who may legitimately apply force. While following analytical school, law is command of the sovereign, which in this case the parliament, as this act is the product of parliament. Therefore, it is enforced by judges, police, officers of National Registration Department, medical officers, and government medical servants. That's all from us. Thank you.